שלום לכולם. אורחנו המכובד פרופסור כהנמן, ראש הממשלה לשעבר ורעייתו, דיקן הפקולטה למדעי הרוח, פרופסור ברטל, ראש בית הספר לחינוך, פרופסור וקסלר, קהל נכבד ומשפחת פוקס. Welcome, ברוכים הבאים, to the second memorial lecture in memory of Professor Seymour Fox, founder of numerous educational endeavors, including our Melton Center for Jewish Education, an illustrious head of the Hebrew University School of Education, pioneer of the Mandel School for Educational Leadership. We're honored to have Professor Kahneman deliver tonight's lecture. A few words of greetings from me and a few others on behalf of the center. המדרש מספר על חבורה של סועדים בבית הכנסת בטבריה, שהיו מזלזלים בשמש, שהיה גם המורה. אבל כשאחד מן החבורה נפטר, הוא הפקיד את בנו ביד הסופר. כי אז כן עתה. על אף החשיבות והמודעות לחשיבותה של נשי ואנשי חינוך, אין הם זוכים לכבוד הראוי להם. פוקס היה בין יחידי הסגולה, אם לא היחיד, שהצליח בכוח אישיותו, בחריפות שכלו ובחזונו, לשכנע את העולם, בעל המאה כבעל הדעה, להשקיח בחינוך ולכבדו. הוא הביא גרביטס לתחום. הוא בנה מרכז לחינוך יהודי לתפארת, שהפך המרכז הראשון במעלה בעולם כולו. הוא יזם תוכניות מוצלחות בחינוך היהודי. על משקל מה שנאמר במשנה בסוטה, אני מצטט, מי שמת רבן גבריאל הזקן בטל כבוד התורה, אנו נאמר גם מי שמת פרופסור פוקס בטל כבוד החינוך, לא פחות ולא יותר. מי ייתן ונזכה להזכיר ללכת בדרכו ולהחזיר עטרה ליושנה. אני מתנצל עבור הנשיא פרופסור מנחם בן ששון שביקש לברך ונאלץ לנסוע לחו"ל. כבוד הוא לי לבקש מדיקן הפקולטה למדעי הרוח, פרופסור ישראל ברטל, שיישא ברכה.
מכובדיי כולם, קהל נכבד, משפחת פוקס היקרה, בשם הפקולטה למדעי הרוח אני מבקש לברך את כל המתכנסים להרצאת הזיכרון על שם פרופסור שלמה פוקס, זיכרונו לברכה. זכיתי להכיר אותו בלימודיי בתעודת הוראה בשנת 1969 באוניברסיטה הזאת, כלומר לפני בדיוק 40 שנה, ישבתי בהרצאה שלו בגבעת רם, ולכן אני יכול לומר שאני נמנה על תלמידיו, אף על פי שזה באמת כבר נראה רחוק מאוד, ואני מקווה שהפעולות החשובות שעשה הפרופסור פוקס לטובת בית הספר לחינוך, ובמיוחד בעניין החינוך היהודי, ומפעלו הגדול שהוא הקמת מרכז מלטון, ימשיך וישגשג גם בשנים הבאות, שנים שבהן, כפי שכולכם יודעים, נאמר פה כבר קודם, אמנם ממקורות חז"ל, כן, על כך שפנה זיוו פנה הדרו של החינוך, ופנה זיוו פנה הדרו לא בגלל שאנחנו לא רוצים בחינוך ולא מבקשים לקדם את החינוך, ולא עושים ככל יכולתנו כדי לקדם את החינוך, אלא ככל הנראה פני הדור כפני החינוך. ואני לא אומר את אותו פסוק שהאסוציאציה שמי שמכיר את פני הדור כפני מה הם. והפקולטה למדעי הרוח שבית הספר לחינוך הוא חלק מרכזי וחשוב ממנה, מצפה ומקווה שאנחנו נזכה לימים טובים ואחרים במה שנוגע לחינוך, לחינוך יהודי, לחינוך במדינת ישראל, להעלאת קרנו של החינוך, לגרום לכך שגם יושבי מעלה, באזור שהוא קצת ממערב עלינו, במרכז ירושלים, ידעו שחינוך הוא חשוב יותר מכפי שאשר נותנים לנו להרגיש שהוא חשוב. ואולי זה סמלי שאנחנו מקבלים כאן הרצאה מפי פרופסור כהנמן, שהוא בעל פרס נובל לכלכלה, שאולי נשמע, אני מקווה שיעזור לנו בעניין, כן, כיצד מחברים כלכלה עם חינוך לטובת עתידה של מדינת ישראל, לטובתו של בית הספר לחינוך, לטובתו של מרכז מלטון ולטובת כולנו. ושוב אני חוזר ומברך את כולנו, ובמיוחד אני מבקש לברך את פרופסור כהנמן שנאות לשאת את ההרצאה הזאת, והתבקשתי מנשיא האוניברסיטה העברית פרופסור מנחם בן-ששון להביא גם באופן רשמי את ברכתה של האוניברסיטה העברית כולה למשתתפים, למארגנים ולכל אלו הנמצאים פה. תודה.
כבר היה כדאי להתכנס. אני מציג את ראש המרכז שלנו, פרופסור גבי הורנצ'יק, בבקשה.
כבוד גדול הוא לי להציג בפניכם את פרופסור דניאל כהנמן, שמחקריו החדשניים והמקוריים היוו השראה לכולנו כאן באוניברסיטה העברית כסטודנטים וכחוקרים. בתפקידי כמנהל המרכז לחינוך יהודי על שם מלטון, אני שמח על הזכות שנפלה בחלקי לעמוד כאן במעמד חשוב זה. נמצאים בקהל איתנו אנשי סגל האוניברסיטה, סטודנטים, אורחים נכבדים אחרים, המגיעים מתחומים שונים ומגוונים לשמוע וללמוד על תחום מרתק, על מחקרים מאירי עיניים ועל מסקנות מאלפות. רבים מאיתנו יבחנו איך ניתן ליישם את התובנות שנשמע להן לתחומי הידע והעיסוק השונים, והיישומים הללו רבים ולעיתים מפתיעים. לפני מספר שבועות נתקלתי בכתבה פרי עטו של ג'רום גרופמן, פרופסור לרפואה מהרווארד מדיקל סקול, בה הוא מספר על כשלים בטיפול הרפואי שניתן לאמו בבית החולים. וגרופמן מסכם, It turns out that about 15% of all complaints are misdiagnosed. Many people assume that such diagnostic mistakes are related to technical factors, like mixing up tubes of blood in the laboratory so that the results given to the physician are for the wrong patient. Such technical errors are, in fact, rare. The vast majority of misdiagnoses are related to cognitive biases, thinking traps that occur more often under time pressure and uncertainty. Many of these biases were identified by the cognitive scientists דניאל כהנמן ועמוס טברסקי. הכתבה מפרצת סוגים של הטיות שזוהו על ידם ושיכולות לעזור לנו להסביר וכך גם לצמצם אבחון רפואי מוטעה. גרופמן טוען שהרפואה המודרנית השכילה להיעזר בהתפתחות מדעית בתחומים רבים, כגון ביולוגיה מולקולרית, הנדסה ומדעי המחשב, אך רופאים עדיין לא למדו מספיק להסתייע בתובנות העולות ממחקרים בתחום הפסיכולוגיה ומדע הקוגניציה, כגון אלו של כהנמן, טברסקי ואחרים. זו רק דוגמה אחת מיני רבות שמעידה על הרלוונטיות העצומה של התחום שעליו נשמע היום, מפי חוקר דגול, לידע הכללי וגם לעבודתנו במקצועות שונים ולתגובותינו לאתגרים קשים ומגוונים. I'm pleased and honored to introduce to you Professor Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs of Princeton University. He's also Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs Emeritus at the Woodrow Wilson School, the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Princeton University, and a Fellow of the Center for Rationality at the Hebrew University. Professor Kahneman was born in Tel Aviv, completed his first degree in Psychology and Mathematics at the Hebrew University, and received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Kahneman has held the position of Professor of Psychology at the Hebrew University, the University of British Columbia, and the University of California, Berkeley. Daniel Kahneman has been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards. In 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for having integrated insights from psychological research into economic science, especially concerning human judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. In 2007, he received the Lifetime Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association. Professor Kahneman holds honorary degrees from numerous prestigious universities, and we are delighted to host him here at the Hebrew University. Before we invite Professor Kahneman to deliver our second Seymour Fox Memorial Lecture, Mr. David Fox will say a few words on behalf of the Fox family.
Thank you very much, Marc, Gabi, Israel. Thank you for organizing this event. I also want to specifically mention former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who is here today. Not only was he a friend to my father, but he was one of the people my father most highly regarded, especially for being among the few policymakers who was most committed to the causes our father believed in, education here and in the Jewish world. Now, as I look at this invitation here, it's clear that something is wrong. There's a Professor Menachem Hirshman, Professor Gabi Horenczyk, Professor Israel Bartal, Professor Dani Kahneman, and then there's a Mr. David Fox. Something doesn't make sense here. The only reason that's the case is because my brother, Professor Danny Fox, who was supposed to be speaking here, didn't think he could make it here. He did make it here. He's here with his wife, Laureate. He got it here especially last night. So on his behalf, on Eitan's behalf, on Sue's behalf and her children's behalf, we're very grateful that Danica Kahneman accepted the invitation to speak here this evening. Now, our father considered Danica Kahneman a friend and admired his work long before it became cool to admire his work. Many of you know our father enjoyed teaching and being involved with curriculum and students probably more than any other activity. But dealing with curriculum with Danica Kahneman at this Hebrew University in the 70s was probably a source of joy and energy that I never saw him experience ever before and ever since. Anyone who knew my father knows that the central question to his life, and one he asked probably too many times for some of the people in this room, was, how do you know that? Or in its Talmudic version, Mina Hani Mili. And even though my father was a very intuitive person, and I dare say even though he wasn't a fireman, he wasn't a master chess player, he was an expert at intuition. All his life he struggled to enforce rationality, and I think the central tenets of his life work, was reflection on systematic decision making. So I'm going to take a risk with this crowd and with Danica Kahneman and end with a short intuition that I have for which there is going to be no feedback and for which I have no evidence. Our father is very happy that Danica Kahneman is speaking here tonight. Thank you very much.
קהל נכבד, משפחת פוקס, אני נרגש להימצא כאן. לא היה לי לגמרי ברור כשאני הסכמתי לתת את ההרצאה, מדוע אני מסכים לתת את ההרצאה. אני מרצה מעט מאוד בשנים אלה, בתקופה הזו. כשראיתי את התמונה של סיימור ואת החיוך של סיימור, אני הבנתי יותר מאשר מקודם מדוע הסכמתי לתת את ההרצאה הזאת. אתם יכולים לראות מי היה סיימור, מי שלא הכיר אותו. הייתה התלהבות, הייתה אופטימיות, הייתה קצת אירוניה, הייתה חוכמה, הייתה יכולת, הייתה תחושה שהכל אפשרי. אם יש הר אפשר להזיז אותו, ואם אי אפשר להזיז אותו באופן אישי אז אפשר למצוא אנשים אחרים ולהביא אותם שהם יזיזו את ההר. היכולת שלו להפעיל אנשים, היכולת שלו להלהיב אנשים, הייתה מדהימה, ואני הייתי אחד מן הנהנים. אני גם הייתי מן הנהנים מפני שתקופה מסוימת אנחנו עבדנו ביחד, ואחד הסיפורים שבו הוא בחציו גיבור ובחציו לא כל כך גיבור, אני אספר לכם את הסיפור, הוא היה אחד הסיפורים החשובים בקריירה שלי בעצם, שעליו אני אדבר אחר כך. אני אדבר אנגלית, כך נקבע בהתחלה, אני אדבר אנגלית. There is a debate about intuition. It's actually a big debate these days. And there are some who focus on the marvels of intuitions. And there are some who focus on the flaws of intuition. And indeed, intuition has both marvels and flaws. The story... And indeed, intuition has both marvels and flaws. Is this better? Can you hear me at the end? That's going to cramp my style a lot. Okay. My own history is a focus on flaws. Many years ago, actually it started about 40 years ago, Amos Tversky and I at this university began our research on judgment under uncertainty and on heuristics and biases, which had, I think, a significant influence, actually, in raising doubts about the quality of intuition and about the quality of expert intuition in particular. And there is a whole movement that is associated with it. There is an organization, we have a scientific organization, the Judgment and Decision-Making Society. Professor Maya Bar-Hillel, he counted that there was, I think, 6 Israelis who have been presidents of this association in its 25 years. And there was also a group that left the association in anger. And that group was led by someone who I'm now very happy to call my friend, Gary Klein. And they left the Judgment and Decision-Making Society because they felt that it was very biased, and that it was very biased against intuition. Most of the people in what is now called the naturalistic decision-making group are practitioners. They're not at universities, they work with organizations, they work with experts, and they see what experts can do. And then when they read the literature that we guys produce, which, by the way, they do very little, but when they do read what we write, they feel contempt, and they feel that this simply doesn't describe what they see. Now, a number of years ago, about 6 or 7 years ago, I have always been a fan, actually, of that work. I have always been a fan of the people who think that intuition is wonderful. And a few years ago, I had the idea of joining forces with Gary Klein, who is the guru of the Naturalistic Decision-Making Society, to explore our differences, and maybe to write a joint article describing, what it is that we agree or do not agree on. That article was finally published about 7 years later. It was published, and its title actually tells the story. Its title is A Failure to Disagree. That is, we spent 7 years of bitter disagreement, actually. But we couldn't disagree on anything substantive. That is, whenever we discussed a real point of psychology, of what is actually happening, we always ended up agreeing. The interesting part of it was that emotionally, we never even came close. That is, he still dislikes everything to do with biases. And he still dislikes, actually, he really dislikes my work quite a lot. He respects it, but he just wishes it didn't exist somehow. And very recently, so the article was published a couple of months ago, and last month, at his urging, we had a celebration dinner at a New York restaurant. And 2 weeks before that, he sent me his latest book, which I think is very good, but you will see why I only think it. He wrote me a very warm dedication. The book is called Streetlights and Shadows. And I think the point that he's trying to make is that academics tend to look for things where there is light on them, but they don't look for things where they are. I think that's the idea of the book. The dedication was very warm, and on top of it, there was a little post-it on top of the book which said, "I hope you never read this book." And then it said, "And if you read it, certainly don't read it before our dinner." And I had seen enough of the book before to know that he was absolutely right, and that if I had read the book, we would not have had as pleasant a dinner as we ended up having. Because the debate about intuition is not only intellectual. Actually, I think intellectually there is hardly any debate now. But there is an emotional debate about intuition. The people who think that intuition is marvelous feel very strongly about it. And the people who have an ironic view of what experts can do have a different view of it. And it's a bit about that I'll talk today. So let me begin by examples of marvels. And evidently, I think Mr. Fox had read the article that Gary Klein and I wrote because he cited several of the examples. Gary Klein began his career studying fireground commanders. Those are people who command companies of firefighters. And his idea was to find out how these people make decisions. And he thought that they probably considered 2 or 3 plans, and then they choose between those 3 plans, and he wanted to find out what is the process by which they decide between these 3 plans. And it turns out that was his discovery, that that's not the way fireground commanders work. They don't consider 3 plans. They consider 1 plan. It's the first plan that comes to their mind, and they act on it. And usually it's right. And this is the work of intuition. This is a marvel of intuition, that you have a problem, it's a difficult problem, and the solution to the problem just comes to you, and you act on it. And that turned him and his followers into admirers of what intuition can be. He has many such examples, such as, you know, a paramedic coming home and looking at her grandfather, at her father-in-law, and saying, "We are going to the hospital." And says, "Why should we go to the hospital? I feel fine." And she says, "No, we're going to the hospital because you're not well." And they go to the hospital, and he's about to have a very serious heart attack. And he is on the operating table within a couple of hours. And what she had responded to, she didn't know what she was responding to. It turns out that before a heart attack, there are obstructions to the blood flow, and there is a pattern of blood flow in the face that she had learned to recognize, although she had never been taught it, and she didn't know she knew it. But this was the pattern that she recognized in her father-in-law, and that saved his life. Eventually, Gary Klein, and I'm not sure whether he was involved in this or one of his followers, they actually analyzed this so that now this can be taught, so that now you can teach paramedics and nurses in the cardiac ward, you can teach them to look for that particular pattern. So this is the work that these people do, the naturalistic decision-making people do, and it's wonderful work. Now, they speak of experts with an enormous amount of awe, but the awe, and you know, another famous example, of course, is master chess players who look at the situation and say, you know, white mates in 2 and they're always right, and all the moves that occur, that come to the mind of a master chess player, all the moves are good. It's just a question of picking the best, which they do by careful analysis. But there is a selective process that picks out the strongest moves, and that is an intuitive process. Now, we shouldn't really, thinking of experts like that and of stories like that, especially the dramatic stories, is fascinating. And Malcolm Gladwell has sold, I think, 4 million copies of a book called Blink that appeals to the fascination of intuition. But it's much exaggerated because actually all of us are experts in different ways. For example, every single one of us, when we pick up the phone and we talk to our spouse, we can tell whether our spouse is angry or not. And it doesn't take long. It takes probably less than a full word to recognize the music, the melody, and we're all experts in doing that. We have learned to do that. We have learned to recognize anger in a voice, and it's very much the same thing as for a fireground commander to see a situation and recognize that this is the way to approach that particular fire. So all of us in many domains, especially the social domain, because we've had a lot of experience in it, have learned to operate intuitively. So I think we should, in some sense, and this is important to recognize, we should relax on the notion that it's exclusively a definition of expertise. It's not only a definition of expertise, or if it is, all of us are experts. Now, I want to show my slide. Okay, great. I want to show you 2 definitions of intuition. The first one is simple, and everybody loves it. And it says that intuition is knowing without knowing how you know. And it really is beautiful, and Gary Klein, I'm sure, loves it. I haven't discussed it with him. And it's quite misleading, really. And it's misleading because you can't know something unless it is true. So this definition, in fact, invites you to believe that every intuition is true, otherwise it wouldn't be an intuition. Now, if you define intuition that way, you're going to end up admiring intuition a lot, because all intuitions are true, and then they're sort of miraculous. You know something and you don't know that you know. The other definition is so complicated that I won't even bother to read it in full, but it is by the great Herbert Simon, one of the great minds of the 20th century, and And basically, he's exasperated with the notion of the magic of intuition. And he's telling us there is no magic there. All that happens is you recognize a situation. And that's the intuition. Now, you know, this is spoken in jargon. Let's just skip to a blank slide so you don't have to bother about the jargon, but let me give you an example of a process of recognition. You see a dog, or a child sees a dog and says, oh, it's a poodle. Now, how do you know that it's a poodle? Well, you know it's a poodle, and you really don't know how you know that it's a poodle. Because to make a list of all the cues that made you believe that it's a poodle, that's not the way we work. The way we work is we recognize it. It's a poodle. And when intuition works, this is how it works. It works by a process of recognition. So there is no magic in it. But of course, if you recognize something, there must have been a history behind it that allows you to recognize it. You have learned to recognize it. So there is no magic. And when Gary and I discussed that issue, we agreed on that both of us are not interested in the idea of intuition as magical, that both of us want to demystify intuition, take the mystique away, because the mystique really gets in the way. Now, intuition is a process by which you learn to recognize things. They can be very complicated things, and you may not know how you came to recognize them. So that's going to be our starting point. Oops. Now, to say a bit more about naturalistic decision-making and Gary Klein, and a few of the things that they believe in and don't believe in, and why emotionally it was so hard for us to get together, they really believe that that there is such a thing as expertise. And it is true that when people in my field look at experts, we tend to look at them ironically. And we tend to believe that they make errors, and we tend to look for the errors they make, and we tend to find the errors very interesting. Gary Klein is less skeptical about experts. He believes they really know something, and he doesn't feel ironic, and when he sees them making a mistake, he's sad. He's not pleased. And that was one of the main differences between us. That I usually find mistakes kind of amusing and rather pleasant, and what he loves is to see a system, like an algorithm or a set of rules that produces a foolish result. This, for him, is a source of great joy. And for me, it's a source of embarrassment. So psychologists who are ironic about expertise tend to believe that you adopt a rule and you follow a rule and you follow a procedure and you try to be rational about things and you'll end up with a decent result. And when you end up with an absurd result, and that of course happens occasionally, if not often, then Gary Klein and the people in naturalistic decision-making are pleased. It is, by the way, interesting, and I think worth noting, that basically the sentiment of the public is with Gary Klein. The sentiment of the public is pro-intuition. That is why that first definition of intuition as knowing without knowing how you know, that is why it is so appealing. We love the magic. We find it thrilling when we hear stories of people knowing things without knowing how they know. And we tend to believe, and this is getting to be very serious, we tend to believe people like generals and presidents who tell us that they act from their gut, they just know how to act, and they don't ask themselves too many questions, and they're very sure and very confident in themselves. And when they are successful, we give them an enormous amount of credit, especially when they do something that other people would not have done. Many generals, very important generals, were extraordinarily successful, and they believed it was because they were able to see things that other people were not able to see. And many other people believed the same way about them. And in fact, as a psychologist, I would say they were lucky. And this is what psychologists would very often say about successes that look magical. Luck was involved. Sometimes it's not pure luck. Sometimes it is simply taking a risk that is greater than the risk that other people would be willing to take in your place. And then if you're successful with your gamble, you look like a genius, and people who doubted you to begin with look mediocre, look like doubters, look like wimps. We are very powerfully biased in favor of intuition, and I think many people take advantage of us by emphasizing or creating the idea that they are endowed with intuition. I should add that George W. Bush gave intuition a bad name, and it's now much easier to speak against intuition after his presidency. But during his presidency, it was a little harder. Now, let me talk about flaws, and let me illustrate a flaw. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, what's interesting about this problem is that a number came to your mind immediately. In fact, let me use the word. A number came to your mind intuitively, immediately. That number is 10 cents. Everybody thinks of 10 cents first. That number is wrong. So not everything that comes to your mind first is right. This number is wrong, and you can calculate that it's wrong. The correct answer is 5 cents. Some people worry about this for the rest of the lecture, so let me just tell you, take my word for it, it's 5 cents. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And what is interesting about this problem is that 50% of Princeton students get it wrong. They get it wrong when you give it to them in writing. 40% of students at MIT get it wrong, and Harvard is worse than Princeton. Now, what is happening here? What's happening is that if you bother to check, so you say 10 cents, and the bat costs $1 more, so the bat costs $1.10. $1.10 and 10 cents is $1.20. It's supposed to be $1.10, so that's wrong. So what do you know about anybody who says 10 cents? You know very important things about them. You know they didn't check. That's what you know. Because if they had checked, they wouldn't be doing this. Because if they had checked and they knew it was a mistake, they would fix the mistake. At Princeton, they would. I hope. Anyway, this is an important problem for what it tells us. It tells us that we have an associative system which delivers answers. It tells us that a particular dog is a poodle. It tells a chess master what to do. It tells the fireman what to do. And it's sometimes right, and then it's wonderful, and sometimes it just falls on its face, and it's silly. And the point that I want to make is subjectively, you can't tell whether the intuitions that you have are wonderful or silly. They feel the same. Something comes to your mind, and it comes to your mind with force and with vigor and with confidence. And that's it. That's what you know, because you know, you feel you know, without knowing how you know. So until you check, you have no idea. All you have is the confidence. So intuition typically comes with a lot of confidence, whether it is right, as in the cases we mentioned, or wrong, as in the case of the bat and ball. Here is an old example that I suppose quite a few of you are familiar with. I'll read it anyway. It's an example that Amos Tversky and I came up with. Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, we composed this problem like 25 years ago, if not more, almost 30. And at the time, everybody in the United States not only knew what Linda was doing, but they knew which university she was from. They thought she was from Berkeley, because that's what students at Berkeley, that were the stereotype of Berkeley students. We asked about Linda, what is she more likely to be, a bank teller or a feminist bank teller? It's a straight question. What is more probable? Is she a bank teller or is she a feminist bank teller? 85% of students at Stanford say she is more likely to be a feminist bank teller than a bank teller. This is stupid. But people do it. Bright people do it. Everybody wants to do it. And you feel that she really doesn't look like a bank teller, does she? But feminist, now you're talking. I mean, this has some appeal. This is an intuition. It's a wrong intuition. So there are intuitions that are right, and there are intuitions that are just not so right. Recently, there is talk about a two-system view of the mind, where you have one system that produces intuitions. It acts very quickly, it produces those ideas that come to mind very quickly. And there is another system that thinks, is much more slower and works one step after the other and does reasoning and follows rules. And the system that we're discussing mostly today is system one. In fact, I won't go into that a lot because it's not an essential part of my story. There are no two systems in the brain, but it is true that there are two different ways of doing things that are characteristically different. And one of them is automatic and effortless, and I will explain what associatively coherent is in a minute by a nasty example. And the other one is controlled and effortful and logically coherent. That's what you do when you say 10 cents, $1.10 makes $1.20, not right. That's system two. That is not system one. So what we know about the Princeton students who make a mistake about the bat and ball problem is that they follow system one and they're not influenced by system two. If they invoked system two, they would get it right. System two is effortful. It's costly. It takes time. It takes work. People don't like doing this, not only at Princeton, anywhere. There are universities, by the way, of the United States, quite well-known universities, where 90% of people get it wrong. So this business of checking doesn't come very naturally to most of us most of the time. Now, I told you I'd use a nasty example. Actually, you know what? I'll come back to that nasty example later. Let me talk about something else, and then I'll get to the nasty example. I was telling you about flaws of intuition. So I told you about how Gary Klein's career started. I can tell you about how my career started in this field. It started a lot earlier than his. I was a soldier in the Israeli army. I was a lieutenant in the psychological branch. And we were looking at officers. Not at officers. We were looking at candidates for officer training school. And there was an exercise, I won't go into a lot of detail, but some of you may be old enough to have been through this. There were exercises that were done in the field. People got very sweaty and very tired carrying poles over obstacles. And we, the psychologists, would watch them with care. And what happened, you spent 10 minutes watching these people, and you were absolutely confident that you knew every one of them inside out, because they were under tremendous stress. You know, they were trying to take a pole, a heavy pole, and pass it to the other side of the wall without the pole touching the wall or the ground or anybody touching the wall. Complicated rules. They sweated a lot. It was very hot there. There was no one in charge. They had to do it cooperatively. And we had a wonderful time watching their personalities in action. So we could really tell, you know, who was good at this and who wasn't good, who was a natural leader, who was a bad guy. We could tell a lot of things. And on the basis of that and a little more information, we decided who would go to officer training school. And then every month, a couple of months, there would be a Friday. It was always a Friday. We had a statistics day. And on the statistics day, we would get information from officer training school telling us how well we were doing. So we knew the grades, and then we knew how well the same people that we had sent there were quite a few we hadn't sent, the people we had sent there, how well they did at the school. It's a very short story to tell. We were no good whatsoever. We had no idea what they were doing in officer training school. Our validity was close to zero. Now, it was really shocking. It was really quite bad news. So that happened Friday, like every month or two. We had a depressing Friday where, we learned that what we were doing was completely useless. But it was, it's the army. So Sunday, they would bring a new batch of people, and we'd take them to the obstacle course, and they would grab the pole and take it over the wall, and we would see their personalities naked before us. We absolutely, as if we had never heard about the statistics. What we knew made absolutely no contact with what we felt. We had the intuition that we knew everything about these people. We had the knowledge in our head that we knew nothing, and the knowledge really didn't matter very much. We went by the intuition. So there are some problems with intuitions. And now let me tell you a story that involves Seymour Fox, and in which neither he nor I come off very good. You'll see the story. There was a period in the 1970s during which we set up a team to construct a curriculum about judgment under uncertainty for high schools. And we really thought it was going to be a great thing. It would involve no mathematics, but it would be a very well-developed curriculum. And we had a bunch of people working with us, all gifted. It was a lovely group. And we met every Friday afternoon. And we had worked for about a year together, and that's where I got to know Seymour and like him a lot. And that's why I'm here. And every Friday afternoon, we would get together, and one day, I don't remember why, I had the idea of asking the group, look, we've never asked ourselves, how long will it take us? That shows how clever we were. How long will it take us to complete the book? So let's do it right. Everybody write on a slip of paper how long they expect us to take before we complete the book. So everybody did that, including Seymour, including me, and then we put it on the blackboard, which is the right way to do it. And all the estimates were between 18 months and 30 months, a year and a half to 2.5 years. We felt very good about those estimates. But Seymour was an expert on curriculum development. And so I had an idea. I asked Seymour, look, do you know other people like us, other teams who are doing what we are doing, creating a curriculum where none existed before? And he said, yeah, sure, I know quite a few. That was wonderful. So I said, can you visualize where they were when they were roughly where we are at the stage of progress that we have achieved? We're really doing quite well, we thought. And Seymour thought for a minute. I don't remember exactly what he looked like, but in my legend, he blushed. I don't think Seymour blushed a lot, actually, but this is what he said. And that I remember distinctly. He said, look, it had never occurred to me before, but not all of these teams succeeded. That was a completely new thought. We had never, the idea that we might fail had never occurred to us. He said about 40% of them never wrote a book. That was a little worrying. So then I asked the obvious question. I said, yes, and those who did write a book, how long did it take them? So he thought for a moment, and he said, look, it's interesting, but I can't think of anybody who took less than 7 years. And the maximum, he said, I can't think of anybody who lasted more than 10. So there we knew. Actually, I asked him another question, which I remember very well. I was getting sort of desperate, and the morale was low. So I said, if you compare us to the other teams that you've been thinking about, where are we? How do we stand up? And he hesitated for a moment, I think, and said, we're below average. He said, but not by much. Now, this turned out to be one of the most instructive afternoons of my life, because I made a great deal. I've published this story several times. I like it so much. What it does is it shows two completely different ways of thinking about a problem. And one is the obvious, the natural way of thinking about a problem, which is what all of us had done, including Seymour, including me. When you think how long it will take, you have your ways of doing it. You think about that problem. But there is an alternative, which is not to think about you, but to think about a class to which your problem belongs. That is clearly a system 2 operation. What is remarkable, and I think quite important to understanding how intuition system 1 and system 2 works, is that Seymour had that information in his head, and he didn't use it. It did not come to mind. So the associative system does not invariably deliver to you everything that is relevant, which is in fact in your mind. That's an important lesson. So I was very pleased with that story. The irony of the story struck me, I mean the further irony, struck me only some years later, and I'm really quite embarrassed by this. For several years when I was thinking about this story, I was thinking about Seymour. I mean, you know, he clearly is one of the most intelligent people I knew, and obviously what he was doing was something that everybody would do, and his natural bent was to take the inside view where the outside view would have been better. What I didn't realize for a while, actually, and I can't reconstruct it, was there is a real idiot in this story, and that's me. Because what we should have done, we should have quit that afternoon. Nobody, no member of the team, not Seymour, not I, not every one of the others, wanted to spend 8 years with a probability of 40% to fail in writing that miserable curriculum. We didn't. It was too embarrassing. We could not face reality. That, by the way, I think, is not such a rare event. That is, you know the truth, but you somehow cannot digest it, you cannot act on it, you cannot operate with it. So we didn't. We actually carried on. If anybody's curious, it took 8 years. The book was finished. I was no longer in the country. It was finished by Duyt and other people, and you know, they did hand in the book to the Ministry of Education. I don't think it was ever used. But it has been used extensively in psychology because, you know, the story is well known. And there is something that is called now the planning fallacy, that is the term associated with it. And many articles have been written about the planning fallacy. So it wasn't a complete waste of time. And actually, there is now the American Planning Association has a recommendation to everybody who does planning to do that exercise. They call it reference class forecasting, to think from the outside about your problem, because your inside intuitions are likely to be biased, and if you have a plan, your inside intuitions are likely to be very optimistic. And there is a whole research project going on, especially at Oxford now, which involves this general idea. So now, I said I would do something disgusting. Now, you've seen it. Now, quite a lot happened to you during the couple of seconds while you were staring at these two words, which of course you couldn't help doing. Now, let's look for a moment about what happened. Your mind was flooded by images and memories, all unpleasant. Your body reacted. I mean, everything that I'm telling you is based on research. This is really a fact. You you sweated slightly, your heart rate accelerated. I mean, there were bodily changes. A clear physiological response to this, and you even moved a bit. You moved away from the screen. You recoiled. It's been measured. This actually happens. Those changes are very slight, but they're very regular, completely reliable. You can really count on them. Now, your face, that you may have been aware of, your face twisted. You had an expression of disgust. Something else happened to you. You automatically came up with a story. Not a complete story, a sketchy story. Nobody told you that the bananas were the cause of the vomit, but that's the way you thought about it. You couldn't help it. This is the way our mind works. We see those two things together, and there is a possibility of creating some causal connection. We see them as connected, in this case, left to right. And you became more vigilant than usual, more alert. And the most interesting change occurred in your associative memory. Because if we tested your ability to recognize words, it would change after this very brief exposure. And that is really quite interesting. You are prepared, the phenomenon is called priming, so we show you a word, and it changes your readiness to recognize other words. Now, which other words? Well, you'll recognize everything that is associatively correlated with vomit. Nausea, disgust, sickness, many nasty things. If we present any of these words, you will see them more quickly, you will recognize them more quickly, it will take less energy and a shorter time on the screen for you to read them correctly. You're ready. You're ready for these words. This is very, very strange. Now, this is the basic mechanism of System 1. This is how System 1 works. This is how associative memory works. And notice what it does, because it is supremely intelligent. In a sense, it is part of recognition. You recognize the words vomit and banana, but look at what you did with it. You did a lot with it. What happened was you are now in a new state because of that stimulus. You're ready for something that could happen. And it's odd, you know, that your body is ready for something that certainly will not happen. But that's the way we're built. We think with our body. We think entirely as one unit. So that one unit is now prepared for bad things to happen that have something to do with bananas and something to do with vomit. And all of that because you saw those two words on the screen for a couple of seconds. Much of human intelligence is embodied in that story. It's our ability, on the basis of a new stimulus, to create a representation of the world, to be prepared for what has become likely in this new situation. Like if your wife is angry, which you recognize the first word on the phone, that will affect your second word. And if not, it should affect the second thing that you say. And there is a coherence in the way that this associative mechanism works, which is really quite important. You have an emotion, the emotion affects your face. The switch in your face influences your emotional state. Your emotional state affects your physiological state. Your physiological state affects what you think about. Every one of these links has been studied in the last decade. They're all there. And what they do is they enable us, when we see a situation, in this case seeing two words, for the fireground commander seeing a fire, the memory recognizes, but recognition is a very complicated process. It is a very rich process. And it is a process that isn't logically coherent. There is nothing logical about it. It is associatively coherent, This is the way the associative machinery works, and it reflects basically what it does. It reflects the statistical structure of the environment. You have lived in a world, we have lived in a world, in which ideas are interconnected. They don't come at random. They come in clusters. Vomit comes with illness. Illness comes with other things. Illness comes with doctors. Things are related. In our world, situations make sense. And our associative machinery is geared to make sense of that world. And this is one of the ways that we get good intuitions. This is the recognition that Gary Klein is proud of. So, several properties of the associative machinery that we can see in this example. It looks for causal stories. That is very, very important. We always look for causal stories. It looks for stories that make sense. Actually, our associative machinery seems to be built on the following principle, that it takes all the information available and it makes the best story possible out of the information available, the maximally coherent story. That's how it works. Another property, which is an interesting one, another property is that if there is very little information, our associative system doesn't care. So long as it can make a good story, it will make a good story. So when we were there in the obstacle fields, like, 50 years ago, whatever, more than 50 years ago, watching those sweaty soldiers carrying the pole, we thought we saw them in combat. We could see them as officers. We saw very, very little. But we formed an impression, and what we didn't know is how little we knew. That is not represented in the associative machinery. The associative machinery tells the best story it can from the information available. Information that is not available is not in the story, and it isn't missed. People don't check. They don't look for information they don't have most of the time. They just tell the best story possible, and they carry on with life. Which means that if we follow system one, and it happens to be right, it's going to be wonderful. And if it happens to be wrong, we're going to follow through anyway, and we're going to find out, if we're going to find out, that we've made a mistake. Now, here is something that Gary Klein and I agreed on. It took us a while, actually, to agree on it, but I think we seriously agree on this. He wasn't happy, but it is that subjective confidence is a miserable criterion for deciding whether an intuition is right or wrong. Now, think of President Bush. I mean, you can have somebody who's very, very sure of himself, and, he's wrong. Those things do happen. Confidence has nothing to do with it. Subjective confidence is determined by the quality of the story that you tell yourself. If it's a good, coherent story that makes sense of everything you know, even if what you know is unreliable and is too little, and it's not the right part of the story, it doesn't matter. You are going to be confident if you can tell a good story, or if a good story tells itself to you through your associative machine. Now, I think that this is what intuition is. And I think that when intuition works, we can see why it works well. There are several ways in which this associative machinery can go wrong. But before I tell you how it goes wrong, let me tell you one more wonderful way in which it can go right. When you hear recognition, you think recognition, that's pretty dumb. That's not as sophisticated as we feel we are. In fact, recognition can be creative. And I don't want to leave this topic without mentioning how creative recognition can be. There is a famous test that's been in use some 45 years, a test of creativity called the remote associations test, where people are shown 3 words, and they're asked, what is the 4th word that is related to these 3? And here is an example. Cottage, Swiss, and cake. In the United States, it's a very easy example. The word is cheese, so it's cottage cheese and Swiss cheese and cheesecake. Straightforward. Dive, light, and rocket, very hard. Dive, light, and rocket, very few people find. Once they find it, it's absolutely correct. It's sky. It's sky dive, sky light, and rocket and sky are immediately related. Now, the beauty of this is it is indeed the case that very highly creative people are good at that test. That is, they're able to recognize things, to tell stories. Their associative system is capable of finding remote connections. The connections exist. They're not completely making it up. There is no such thing as making something up. It's always associative. It always has to be in your memory before you put things together. There is no magic, there is no miracle. But if you do it right, if you are very bright, if you're highly creative, you'll be able to see those remote connections. Highly creative work is of this kind. It is remote recognition. It is the ability to see connection. There are some absolutely wonderful studies being done these days about the remote association test, because there is something that Gary Klein would be really pleased with. You can show people 3 words, and before they even begin to see a solution, 2 seconds later, you ask them, is there a solution? They don't know the solution. Turns out, half of the time, of course, you present three words that are not connected, where there is no correct solution. People know, not 100% of the time. People know 2 seconds later whether later they'll find a solution. They're better than chance. Much better than chance 2 seconds later. This is a real marvel of the way the associative system works. And I can tell you something else that's even more puzzling. Whether or not they know depends on their mood. If they're in a good mood, they know. If they're in a bad mood, they completely lose touch with their remote association. And we know that creativity and good mood are closely related. And we now know, it's odd, but it's a fact, when you put people in a good mood, they get better at this test. And furthermore, they get better at knowing whether they know. So that is another part of the story. Now, so this is the way the associative system works. We know a lot more about it, and I'll just mention in a few words the latest discoveries about the way the associative system works come from a new development in psychology, which is a revival. Basically, it's a revival of, in some ways, of Freudian psychology. It's a revival of interest in the unconscious. I really didn't believe I would live long enough to see that happen, but yes, it's happening, and it's now one of the most active fields in cognitive psychology, is the study of things that happen without the intervention of consciousness. And I will give you 2 examples of that just to give you a sense, because all of that is part of the way the associative machine works. Because most of the work of the associative machine is hidden from us. It is completely unconscious. So I'll give you the most famous example of priming. Some of you may be familiar with it. I apologize. It's still one of the best. You have people memorize a list of words. And of course, there is a control group and an experimental group, so there is one list and another list. But the important list is a list that includes words like wrinkle, Florida, and maybe you get the idea, the words are associated with old age. Now, people don't think of that, but wrinkle and Florida in the United States means old age. Now, they finish that experiment, and they are sent to another experiment at the other end of the corridor. That's the task. And there is somebody outside who measures the time that it takes them to get to the other end of the corridor. And it is longer if they've thought of Florida and wrinkles. They are now old people. They're old people, they don't know they're old people, they don't know they've been reminded of old age, but something has happened to them, and for a while they're old. And we can make people old, we can make people stupid, we can make people change in many different ways by cues of that kind. People who see, who are in an experiment, and there is a computer to the side that shows dollars floating in water. That's all. Screensaver shows dollars floating in water. That makes you more selfish. If somebody shows up with a bunch of pencils and drops the pencils on the ground, and then an experimenter counts the number of pencils that you pick up fewer pencils as there are dollars floating in the water. Any thought of money tends to make you more selfish. It tends to make you more independent. You ask for less help. It changes the way you think, it changes the way you act. Not for a long time, but significantly enough so that a small number of subjects you can show that this is a statistically reliable effect. All of this is part of the associative machine. Now, the associative machine has another property, and I'm close to the end. The other property of the associative machine is that, and you probably are familiar with this, one of the remarkable things about our thinking is that we're never stumped. That is, people ask us difficult questions and we have an answer. It's very rare that we simply say, I have no idea. I mean, it's not very rare, but let me put it this way, it's not rare enough, because very often we think we have an idea when in fact we have no idea. And what happens there is that, again, it's an associative system. You are asked one question, you don't have the answer to that question, but you happen to have the answer to another question. And that's the answer you give. So you don't know how likely it is that Linda is a bank teller or is a bank teller and a feminist. But there is one thing you know. She looks like a feminist. She doesn't look like a bank teller. Now, you weren't asked what she looks like. You were asked what she is. But that's good enough. You answer one question by answering another. That is also intuitive. Those are called heuristics. Those are the processes that Amos Tversky and I studied. And those are the processes that produce biases, the word that Gary Klein hates, and they produce predictable errors. So the associative machinery that we are discussing is marvelous and it is flawed. It is marvelous, and I've spent most of the time on that aspect because I think it's the most interesting. But it is also flawed because it answers questions it hasn't been asked, because it answers with associations instead of with logic, because it thinks it knows things when it really doesn't know a thing. So all of these things happen. So now, where did Gary and I end up in our analysis? Gary had to agree with me that sometimes it is useful to have forms and to have rules. That sometimes human intuition is very bad, and it's quite easy to formulate simple rules that do better than people do. That was known, in fact, it was known to me when, in 1955, I think, when I was doing those studies in the Army. There is a book by Paul Meehl, published in 1954, that first showed that using simple rules in many cases is better than clinical judgment. This is a major principle. It is still true. There are many tasks that basically people have no business trying to do because simple rules do them better. Sometimes this causes scandals. It's interesting. People don't like rules. A colleague of mine at Princeton has found a way of predicting how expensive a Bordeaux wine will be in 15 years. And it's a pretty good way. You measure three things. You measure the hottest temperature and how much rain there has been, and I think a third thing, I forget what the third thing is. You take those three variables. You don't taste the wine. You don't have to go there. You do a better job than all the experts. Now, you would think that that guy would be popular in France. No, he's not. In fact, if they could burn him alive, they would burn him alive. They don't like him at all. But he still does better than all the experts. So there are situations where rules do better than experts. And we have to be able to recognize those situations. Gary and I think we know when you can trust experts. It's an important question. Never ask them whether they can be trusted. That we agree on. Look at two things. Look at the situation and look at their history. Some situations are sufficiently regular that you can learn them. So you can learn to recognize a poodle because that's regular. The word poodle is associated with a particular pattern in the environment. Some situations are impossible. Long-term political prediction is impossible. So when you put people and they try to make predictions for the strategic situations 15 years from now, there's been research on that. Their validity is zero. It is exactly the same kind of thing that we were trying to do with officer training, and you get the same illusion of validity. Some situations are too complicated. And it is impossible to be successful by intuition buying stocks. Don't try. Many people think they can do it. They're wrong. Many bankers think they're wrong too. Certain things are impossible. And you have to know what the situations are that are impossible. Then you have to ask whether the person had a chance to learn. It takes at least 10 years to learn to be a very, very good chess player so that you can recognize situations. Many complicated situations take about 10 years to learn, 10 years of heavy practice. If somebody is operating in a situation that is sufficiently regular and they've had 10 years of practice and they say something and it's intuitive, probably you can trust them. Otherwise, don't. That basically is my conclusion. Gary would probably end with a more optimistic statement, but I think that's roughly my. I will end with an idea that I learned from Gary, which is actually very atypical of his, because he's a bit embarrassed by it, but I think it's the best idea I've heard about how to control wrong intuitions in the context of planning. It has very little to do with what I've told you, but the idea is so good that I want to tell it anyway. He calls it the pre-mortem. So you have a group of people, an organization, that has made a plan. They haven't executed it, they're not committed yet, but they have a plan, they're about to do something. Gary suggests that these people should get together for a session, takes 45 minutes, and the session begins with the leader telling them, okay, it's a year from today. We executed the plan. It was a disaster. Now you have a sheet of paper in front of you. Write the history of that disaster. Doesn't have to be long. Write a paragraph. How did the disaster happen? This is a wonderful idea. And it is wonderful because you can see what makes it good. It is wonderful because it legitimizes a kind of process for people that in organizations that tend to end up with plans tends to be suppressed. That is, as an organization gets closer to a commitment, doubters get thrown away. Pessimists become unpopular. This makes pessimism legitimate. It's a very good idea. There are procedures, there are ways of thinking that can improve on intuition. We should be looking for those. And I think there is some hope for finding them. And that basically is as far as the story goes, so far as I know today. Thank you.
תודה רבה, פרופסור כהנמן, על ההרצאה המרתקת. יש לנו זמן לשאלות, אני לא מבטיח שנוכל להתייחס לכולן, אבל אפשר להתחיל לנסות. נלך לפי recognition, לפי מה שסיפרו לי כאן. בבקשה. אם אפשר להתקרב לאחד משני המיקרופונים, בבקשה. אז לזה בבקשה. פה. אנחנו עדיין בעד מיקרופון.
מי שכבר יודע שירצה לשאול, שיתקרב למיקרופון.
רעיון טוב, תודה.
Thank you very much. Second, you talk about intuition and you talk about intuitive processes. Can you define and contrast two?
No. I really can't. You know, we can do it. Of course I can do it. What I meant by intuitive processes are those associative processes that yield, you know, a particular form of idea. Ideas that we call intuitive are judgments that we feel we know, so they come with high confidence, but we don't exactly know where they come from, and they typically come fairly quickly. So they're closely linked. There is not, I don't see an interesting distinction between them, but yes, that's as far as I can go.
You did the same about creativity, more or less the same. You talk about creativity, first of all, as a characteristic of something, and then as a matter of mood, changeable. So.
Well, creativity, some people do better on the test of creativity than other people, and individuals do better on the same test at some time than at others. So both statements are true, and in general, individuals do better at tests of creativity when they're in a better mood. And what happens is a good mood tends to suppress system 2. That is, what happens is when you're in a bad mood and you're vigilant, like you've seen a nasty word on the screen, you're not very confident of yourself, so you check things. And that prevents some mistakes and it inhibits creativity. Ruth? את רצית לשאול?
Do you see a similarity between two existing litigation and law. Some big law firms mimic a trial as if they lost it in order to see what went wrong. And in mediation, you bring up the two possibilities, which are called one-time banter. One is the worst case, and one is the best case. And this way, you calibrate yourself of what is going to happen to you.
I think they're closely related. They're similar processes. Basically, they are procedures to force you to think about things you don't want to think about, and to improve intuition in that way. So this, in negotiation, is very clear, that thinking of what you don't want to think about is, your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is something that people don't like to think about. You make them think about it. And the pre-mortem has the same characteristic, that it allows people, in this case, the pre-mortem has a special interpersonal dynamic that is interesting, that it's within the group typically. At the end, when a plan has been made, it's very difficult to raise objections. So the pre-mortem makes it possible. I can say, I gave a related talk, and I mentioned the idea of a pre-mortem, I think, a year ago. At the Israeli Air Force, there was a meeting of the top brass, and the commander then said, this I can use next week. And I've heard that comment from several other people. It's not my idea, it's Gary Klein's idea, so I always make sure that you know and remember whose idea it is. It's better than mine. I don't have as good an idea about what to do about intuition as this one is.
When you spoke about unconscious processes, I was thinking in our rapid responsiveness, I was thinking of Paul Ekman's work on both emotional responsiveness and on deceit. Is that what you had in mind in part when you spoke about our rapid associational processes?
Well, Paul Ekman has doubts about, of course, the micro responses are exactly what Paul describes. That is, that you have micro expressions within a first few seconds, not seconds, hundredths of seconds of hearing some news, which are quite revealing. So you get that little smile or that nasty expression that is suppressed immediately. And that's exactly what I was talking about.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really an honor to hear you in person. In your presentation tonight, you had mentioned that people's minds, people's intuition tend to think causally and not correlationally. In your research, in the research of Thomas Gilovich, which is basically a regurgitation of your research, and well, I use that word maybe because I was primed by the word vomit on the stage.
Much better than that, yeah.
You mentioned that people's minds are trained to look for the information that they know of, and we're not trained to look for the information that proves us wrong. So my question to you is, why, in your paper, didn't you disagree with Mr. Klein, Professor Klein, on more substantive facts or theories or models? And you're clearly more in Model 2. He's clearly in Model 1, so why couldn't you? Well,
because we were discussing, he agrees that Model 2, can fix things. Our debate is about Model 1, and he basically, it's not even a debate, he basically accepts the description of Model 1. He is just very impressed by those cases in which people have had an opportunity to recognize the correct thing. That's true expertise. This is what he is impressed by. And Tom Gilovich and I tend to be more impressed by cases where people think, and they haven't looked. By the way, Jerome Groupman was mentioned, and he's an interesting case because he speaks as if he was one of my crowd, but basically his heart is with Gary Klein. If you read his book, How Doctors Think, you will see that his heroes are people who have intuitions. And he thinks that everybody else is making a mistake. That is, that all the doctors, he describes cases, and eventually the case gets solved. And you get the impression when you read Jerome Groupman that only the last one, the one who solved the problem, got it right, and everybody else got it wrong. He doesn't think like me. I think the last guy is lucky, and that, if a lot of people didn't get it right, it was because the problem was difficult. And the big difference between So Groupman says that he uses cognitive heuristics and so on. The key thing is Groupman is against evidence-based medicine. He doesn't believe in it. He believes in physicians' intuition, and he thinks intuition should be improved. So he really belongs with Gary Klein, not with me.
What does he do with Paul Neal?
I beg your pardon?
What does he do with Paul Neal's research?
Oh, Paul Neal is clearly, I'm a follower of Paul Neal.
But his research contradicts that, what you...
Oh, I mean, you know, Paul Neal isn't right in every situation, but, and Groupman doesn't cite Paul Neal. He says he thinks people should think about heuristics. Really his point is, he thinks intuition is wonderful and should be improved. Yeah.
How do I take this confusion between the intuition and logical thinking into moment-to-moment decision-making in real life? Because what happens is I can be right effortfully every minute, but do we want to live this way?
No. In the first place, you certainly don't want, you couldn't live this way, so it's a hypothetical question. We mostly live on System 1. It's System 1 that is in charge. Most of what we call intelligent behavior is System 1 intelligence. There are occasions when it is good to think, when it is good to stop and think, and when it is good to doubt yourself. That is true for the bat and ball. Why are you in such a hurry? Check. And then you'll see that 10 seconds, you know, that 10 cents is the wrong answer. Why go into Iraq? Check. You know, maybe you shouldn't. So there are situations where it is important to check. And, but they're few and far between. Mostly we're at the mercy of System 1, and it's a good thing we are, because mostly System 1 is excellent.
Last question there, please.
You spoke earlier about subjective confidence in intuition. Is that something that's constant and unique to a person, or is it something that is a function of the amount of information you have? And if so, how do you sway a person from false intuition?
Some people are more confident than others, clearly. That is, with the same amount of information, some people are more confident than others. Men are more overconfident than women. You know, there are many women who are overconfident too. So there are individual differences. To some extent, confidence relies on information that people have, but information can lead you astray. And let me give you an example. The banker in Wall Street, who is trying to guess which stocks are going to go up and which stocks are going to go down, in fact is just guessing. His information is worthless. But he is an expert. He knows how to think about stocks. That is, he knows who to ask, and he knows how to read books and balance statements and all sorts of things. So he has local expertise. And that gives him the idea that he can guess the future of stocks. The same thing is with political experts or people at the CIA who are asked questions about long-term future. They have no idea. But they are experts. They can explain what happened last week. That gives them the illusion that they have something to say about what will happen in 15 years. And that's wrong.
תודה רבה לכולם, תודה רבה לפרופסור כהנמן, לאורחים, ונתראה בעוד שנתיים בהרצאה השלישית לזכרו של פרופסור פוקס. תודה.